Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Hillary Carr, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with JESSE MCCARTHY, presenting his new essay collection, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, and his debut novel, The Fugitivities, joined in conversation by Namwali Serpell. Thank you for joining us virtually tonight. Through events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their works to our community and our new digital community. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. As always, our event schedule also appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time throughout the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will also have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable the captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I'll be posting links to purchase Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul and The Fugitivities on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. JESSE MCCARTHY is an assistant professor in the departments of English and of African and African American Studies at Harvard, and a contributing editor at the Point magazine. His writings on race, literature, politics, and music have appeared in the New York Times Book Review, Harvard Magazine, The Nation, N+1, and Dissent. Tonight, JESSE will be joined by Namwali Serpell, a Zambian writer, professor of English at Harvard, and the author of 7 Modes of Uncertainty, The Old Drift, and Stranger Faces. They'll be discussing JESSE's new books, his essay collection, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, and his debut novel, The Fugitivities, which, in a starred review, Publishers Weekly called a captivating debut, with a rich, lyrically drawn atmosphere and incisive commentary. And the New York Times called Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul a representative sample of McCarthy's genius, in which his analyses and observations are masterfully articulated, as are his dissents. We're so happy to have them here tonight. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours, Namwali and JESSE.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out virtually on this summery Friday night. And thank you to the Harvard Bookstore for hosting us. We're here to celebrate Professor JESSE MCCARTHY's essay collection, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, published by Live Right this past March. The New York Times Book Review says the book showcases the genius of the Black tradition. McCarthy's essays are richly varied. Topics range from the troubling lessons gleaned from the 2015 Bataclan massacre in Paris to the globalization of Harlem's artistic mecca, to trap, or as McCarthy aptly describes it, quote, the funeral music that the Reagan Revolution deserves. He asks what Kara Walker's colossal 2014 Sphinx sculpture entitled A Subtlety, or The Marvelous Sugar Baby, says about history. He profiles the influential poet and scholar Fred Moten and composes an open letter to the R&B artist D'Angelo, whose 2014 album Black Messiah, McCarthy observes, speaks plainly to the unquenchable, unmistakable sweetness of Black life. The collection has been greeted with high praise from the likes of Zadie Smith, who calls it a very smart and soulful book by a terrific essayist, and the New Yorker's Vincent Cunningham, who says the book announces the arrival of a beautiful and beguiling new voice tuned perfectly for the troubles and opportunities of our moment. If this weren't accomplishment enough for 1 year, and in the time of Corona, no less, this past Tuesday, Professor McCarthy just published his debut novel, The Fugitivities, through Melville House. It has received starred reviews from Kirkus and Publishers Weekly. I had the privilege of reading an early draft of the novel, and so I'll quote from my own praise for it. In exquisite, often ecstatic prose, McCarthy gives us a portrait of the artist as a young Black man, or rather as a set of Black men, brothers and friends and rivals. This is Blackness as it collides with class and love, Blackness in its uneasy relationship to Europe and the Americas, Blackness in all of its inner intricacy, tension, and beauty. The novel traces the fugitive flights taken by Jonah, a recent college graduate. We meet him while he's making ends meet as a teacher of low-income students at a school in Red Hook, New York, and living with a fellow teacher named Isaac. After a death in the family grants Jonah some funds, he takes up his friend Octavio's invitation to travel to South America. Just before he leaves, Jonah encounters a former NBA player, Nathaniel Archambault, whose story sits with Jonah's in interesting and resonant ways. They both have a relationship to France, where Jonah grew up and where Nathaniel spent some time learning French after retiring from the sport. They both experience a deepening and ramification of their conceptions of Blackness. Jonah via his travels to come in South America, Nathaniel via the African immigrants he lives with in Paris. And these two men both have a tenuous, intense relationship to a woman in their respective pasts. Jonah to his first love, Arna, with whom he exchanges letters throughout the novel, which we might say is an epistolary novel. It's a novel very much made up of letters and messages. Nathaniel has a relationship to a Lebanese woman named Laura, who he met in Paris and who left him and moved to Montevideo. On a kind of impulse, Nathaniel gives Jonah a letter for Laura to carry with him in case Jonah encounters her on his travels in South America. If not, Nathaniel says it'll be a reason to meet up if Jonah ever returns to New York. With this suspended connection hovering over him, Jonah begins his travels with his friend Octavio, turbulent, melodramatic travels in the way of young people, but also rich with the particularities of encountering the world, the real and whole and complex Black world. We're going to talk about both of these books today. And here Professor McCarthy reads some excerpts from them before we open up for questions from the audience. So hello, Jesse. It's lovely to see you. Thank you so much for bringing these wonderful works of art into our world.
Hi, Namwali. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this and for your praise for the books. I really appreciate it.
So I want to start by asking you quite simply about the different origins and implications of these works for you. How do you feel about nonfiction and fiction as genres available to you? What do they each uniquely afford for you?
Well, I should begin by saying that, it obviously will appear surprising to many people to see these two books come out almost simultaneously, and it's not actually the case that they both came out of an enormous surge of productivity during the COVID pandemic, but rather the essay collection really grows out of writings that I began to publish around 2014, and then continuously up to the present, mostly for small magazines, pieces of cultural criticism and literary criticism that eventually it seemed to me, could be brought together into a kind of reflection on the present or a sort of ongoing moment that we seem to be in, and my attempt to sort of make sense of the important shifts in culture and in the discourse on that culture, and in the many ways in which race, politics, and culture are being reconfigured and rethought in this moment. And so the essay collection, in part derives out of work that's somewhat earlier, and then also more recent essays that I've been working on, but that proceed from fairly long, I would say, longer gestation periods. I'm somewhat actually of a slow writer, and many of these pieces took quite a long time to come together, but then eventually came together into the collection itself. Whereas the novel is actually, in some ways, a much older and more long-standing project, and it reflects to a certain extent the the writer that I was in a certain way in my early 20s. I began work on the novel around 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And, it existed in various states of completion, but, I've spent, I'd say the better part of a decade really working it and reworking it. And it's really actually something of a coincidence that they should both appear now almost at the same time. But I'm not unhappy that they're both out in the world, and to a certain extent, it's true that there are commonalities and themes that run through both, and um, I certainly won't mind if people want to read some of the interests and concerns in one into the other. But they're also deeply different insofar as I think the essays, in many ways, are for me a way of expanding upon my scholarly work and kind of the research that I'm, afforded the privilege of doing, and the reading and writing that I'm able um, to undertake within the context of within an academic context, and
Mm-hmm.
then having a way to kind of have some of those ideas and insights reach a wider audience, and also be engaged in conversations that are in some ways sort of um, more immediate in their temporality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, whereas the novel is not is it sort of comes, I would say, out of a separate sphere in my mind. Not that there aren't overlapping interests and concerns, but in terms of the interest in producing it, I was just really interested in creating the novel. It's a form that I love. I love literature, and I wanted to try and add something to the literary tradition. And I had a sort of conception, really a kind of experiment that I wanted to see if I could work through. Um, and the result is the Fugitivities.
So I want to ask you about the role of argument. You've used the word reflection, insight, ideas about the essays, and obviously they're geared toward a kind of public-facing audience. There's also a sense that you're addressing a very particular period of time. As you said, you started writing the essays around 2014 through now. The novel, however, you wrote at an earlier time, but that also feels like it's looking at a very particular time, the George W. Bush years. And both are interested in Blackness in America to be as reductive as possible. So what I'm curious about is whether the two genres here afford different things for you in terms of making an argument or making claims about certain things, or whether they both feel to you like exploratory forms, nonfiction and fiction.
Well, I do hope that the essays are exploratory and experimental in their own way. One of the things that I wanted the essays to do, in addition to making certain arguments and prodding at certain interventions in ongoing conversations, was also just to sort of suggest and propose in sort of new ways of conceiving of the essay itself, what it can sound like, what it can do, how it might meld different registers. Whereas the novel for me is a form that resolutely does not have an argument.
Right.
And so it is exploratory, but for me, what's more important, if it was successful, uh, is that it achieve a kind of self-contained sense um, of its own existence, of its own um, sort of independent expression,
Mm.
uh, that it feel in some ways both like a self-contained universe, but one, of course, that's also porous, and
Mm.
um, that allows the experience that the reader brings to it, of course, but also the ways in which um, it runs up against all of the historical moment that you just alluded to, sort of Bush the Second, and a kind of particular historical moment in the mid 2000s, but also hopefully a set of questions and problems that also transcend that moment, um, and have a kind of permanent, or perhaps semi-permanent interest, um, that will extend well beyond that
That,
particular moment or this moment.
yeah. I mean, it does seem like the two are obviously very different from each other. They are both experimental. Some of the essays, like the letters to D'Angelo, or the piece about Black Dada, where your voice comes in as a kind of narrator, but also takes on the style of what you're talking about. So I'm interested in the question of style, and particularly in the question of irony, because that's very relevant to my current interests, especially the more subtle forms of Black irony, like shade. And so I'm curious about whether you feel the essay form can include irony, and what the role of irony in the novel was for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's interesting because, to a certain extent, I think oftentimes the essay form, particularly in the history of the essay, when it comes to intervening in questions about um, race and politics, and American history,
Mhm.
it tends to adopt a fairly earnest uh,
Mhm.
tone, for good reason, very often. But I think that can also, be a kind of straitjacket in a certain sense. And there is a way in which um, I would I think actually perhaps more in the essays than in the novel, um, aspects of uh, uh, certain kinds of signifying and shade, as you say,
Mhm.
kind of come in as something that, um, to me, is useful, partly because I want to, uh, I think, as Fred Moten might say, I want to kind of mess with the form of the essay and
Yeah.
sort of interrupt some of the codes and conventions that we bring to it, as expectations that we have as readers. And so, in some ways, I think actually, there that kind of playfulness was easier for me to achieve in the essays, where
Mm.
the authorial voice and style, as a kind of interjecting and projective force,
Mhm.
um, has a kind of positive role, for in my conception, that it creates a certain amount of friction and tension, and disruption.
Mhm.
Whereas in the novel, precisely in order to preserve, I think, um, its sort of self-contained totality, there's at least I hope, I tried to have a kind of retraction of the presence of or the sense of the author intervening, and the author's voice coming in too strongly.
Mhm.
I'm much more interested in sort of the conception of the novel that we often attribute to Flaubert, of the author kind of disappearing
Mhm.
into the text, or not appearing anywhere, and yet having his presence felt everywhere.
Mhm.
That sort of omniscient and admittedly um, perhaps a bit arrogant sense.
It's just a different form of arrogance from the intrusive narrator author figure. I think that captures really beautifully for me the ways in which irony depends so much on the persona of the author, either receding or sort of interjecting, both of which can create forms of irony or forms of contradiction. If we think about irony in terms of plot or event, it was very noticeable to me. Another kind of comparison point, and maybe I just succumbed to the illusion of comparison that literary critics often do when they're looking at two texts. But I did notice that in your novel, when it comes to plot, people often meet by chance. They coincide, their lives seem kind of entangled by contingency, and certain kinds of ironies arise from coincidence. In your essays, there's a similar sense of surprise, in the sense of unexpected juxtapositions between, D'Angelo, but also like Juan de Pareja, 17th century Spanish painter who was born into slavery, but also even within the essays themselves, like the encounter you stage between Kara Walker's Sugar Baby and Benjamin's Angel of History. And I find this kind of juxtaposition incredibly productive, generative. The notion of chance encounter strikes me perhaps even more so than the obvious ironies and beauty of the language in both books as the feature they most have in common. And to go to your point about the earnestness of our contemporary discourses about race, this strikes me as an unusual feature. Our current contemporary conversation about race and history so often emphasizes straightforward causality, blame, reparation, direct exchange. So I'm interested in the role of this kind of oblique, chance, contingent encounter in your work. And if I might press also, how do you think this relates to Blackness or to the Black tradition?
Well, it's a good question and a difficult one to answer. I would say that there is a sense for me that there's often, and one hears sometimes in contemporary literary criticism, a kind of lament at the decline of kind of strong plotting, which is, I think, also associated with a sense of a kind of deterioration of the ability to construct the social novel, where the paths and the grooves that the characters follow feel, well determined and conditioned, not even necessarily in the sense of kind of the social realist novel or even the naturalist novel, where they're just completely overdetermined by circumstance, but rather even that the plot itself should that certain allegorical significance should inhere in what comes of what comes out of plot. And I think that I think part of the reason we have seen somewhat of a decline of the ability to kind of create um, or execute the social novel in that way comes from, to a certain extent, what contemporary life feels like and how it's experienced.
Mhm.
And, when you think about the ways in which so much of our contemporary existence is continuously shot through with, um, a kind of almost unimaginable amount of sort of um, cultural pluralism and contingent events and things that are happening in a completely different part of the world, but that show up immediately in our lives as they're channeled through our devices because we're connected and more than ever before involved in the lives of people who come from all kinds of backgrounds all over the world. There's a great deal of just general human mobility, migration
Mhm.
of various kinds. Um, um, and so, to me, there's a sense in which um, that kind of contingency was something that um, felt true to my experience, but not
Mhm.
just to my personal experience, but my sense of a certain kind of contemporary problem.
Mhm.
And so I knew that I wasn't going to aim to produce an to produce plot in that in that sense, and that
Yeah.
I would embrace contingency to a certain extent in that way. I would also say, because you asked about its relationship to Black life, and I think that it's also true that that um, the title of the novel, The Fugitivities, borrows a, a term that's really coined by the philosopher Fred Moten,
Mhm.
who uses it to kind of describe and think about some of the ways in which Black life is shaped by a history of the fugitive, that is,
Mhm.
of running away, of escape, of stealing away, of a need
Yeah.
to try and operate, to live, to make culture, to make a life,
Mhm.
to enjoy social relations um, in a kind of furtive manner, in part because of uh, the because those things are constructed under and often against various forms of oppressive power.
Yeah.
And so when that happens, contingency can often appear as a kind of necessity, and I think a kind of embrace and an openness. And Moten talks about this and has talked about this at various times about how there's a particularly, for example, under Jim Crow, if you're a Black family and you might have a situation where you need to take somebody in, pretty spontaneously. And
Yeah.
that could be somebody, it could be kinfolk, it could be somebody, a cousin, aunt, an uncle, somebody's traveling, somebody needs to stay somewhere for the night. But it could also even be a stranger, and
Mm.
those things, you develop certain kinds of um, sociality around that. Um, I think he would argue that you also develop a certain kind of sense of aesthetics and a certain
Mhm.
kind of relationship between sociality and aesthetics that grows out of that kind of um, contingent atmosphere that you kind of pick up, with what you have, when you have it, with what's around. And there's, of course, a lot of, you know, sort of famous analogizing here to some of the more celebrated forms, particularly of African American culture. So, for
Yeah.
example, improvisation and jazz,
Mhm.
um, One can think also about the way in which this game or the sport of basketball requires a kind of very fluid, kind of spontaneous improvisation that's coordinated and plotted to a certain extent, right? But is also adapting constantly on the fly to the circumstances that are just emerging at any given moment. And in some pretty obvious ways, those are those are those are elements that inform the novel, and kind of flow into it, and that to a certain extent I'm paying homage to, and also kind of trying to translate according to my own understanding into literary form.
I'd love to hear you read from the novel now, maybe to give our audience a sense of how these chance encounters and improvisatory juxtapositions form a weave of experience. So the scene we had selected is on page 150, beginning with when they stepped back. And I'll just give a little bit of context. In the scene, Jonah, Octavio, his friend, and their college friend, a woman named Bart, who they're visiting and who's working as a teacher in Brazil, are making their way through the favelas of Rio at night.
Okay, thank you. When they stepped back into the alleyways, Jonah noticed that his eyes had adjusted to the darkness. The favela cascaded down below like a river winking with isolated lamps. Somewhere farther above in the honeycomb, the distinctive propellant of American rap sent down snapping echoes of growling bass and syncopated voices interlocking call and response. They followed Bart's back down a different path that took them into a gully and then across a narrow walkway made of wooden planks and back up a new set of stairs as they made their way along the side of the neighboring hill. They came up to a small roundabout with streetcar tracks, Largo das Neves, the square of snows. A strange name for a roundabout in these parts, Jonah thought. The night, with its sudden brushes with death and pockets of eerie tranquility, had turned surreal. His mind jumped from Nas rapping from the point of view of the gun to Villon's Mais où sont les neiges d'antan? Criminal lingo for those in the know. Bold steel shoved in your face runs the blood hot, the mind ice cold. Enough of this, Jonah thought, and Rio would get to feeling like Paris in January. They were ambling gingerly now through streets marked by snaking entranceways to Baroque and once ornate villas that were now caving in on themselves and smothered in knotted arboreal growth. They passed a disquieting mauve facade. Barth said it used to be a dance hall where people came for the samba de gafieira and stayed late into the night. There were plans to reopen it, she said, as a hookah lounge. Eventually, they arrived in the neighborhood of Catumbi, where Barth's friend Teresa lived. Barth had met her at the Universidade Federal, where she took her language classes, and Teresa had more or less become Barth's best friend in Rio. Teresa's house was set back from the road and covered with a fragrant mousse of flowers. Laundry was hanging from the fruit trees on her porch. Inside, an older man with a wizened head of dreads pulled back tightly in rows was rolling a joint on a mouse pad. Teresa introduced him as her boyfriend, Lazaro. He was studying sociology at the State University, trying to document the living conditions of street kids. He smiled quickly and easily and talked in measured tones, often lingering on phrases in English, which he spoke quite well, as he worked the green buds between his thumb and forefinger. The friends made a small circle on the floor, and Lazaro slid in a CD on his computer and lit up the joint as the samba of Cartola filled the room. Octavio asked Lázaro if he could recommend any Brazilian writers for them to read. Lázaro went into his bedroom and came out with a novel by Clarice Lispector for Octavio, and one by Machado de Assis, which he handed to Jonah. Memorias Póstumas de Brás Cubas. Lázaro explained that Machado was one of the greatest Brazilian writers, a Black man. Jonah looked up, met the other man's fixed gaze, and nodded with grave approval. This ceremonious moment led Lázaro to initiate a long conversation about Brazil and the way it had become a lagoon within the ocean of world literature. He was also deeply versed in candomblé and explained that he had written a paper about Nina Rodriguez's anthropological studies on the religious practices of the Africans in Bahia, but so far had been unable to publish it. Given his paltry understanding of the deities whose exotic names Lázaro invoked, Jonah could barely make out what he was saying. But Octavio was deeply enraptured and kept pressing Lázaro for more, occasionally exclaiming in Spanish as he recognized the equivalent of a certain figure or ritual he knew by a Cuban alias. Teresa held the joint precariously and learnedly, tilting her neck way back as she steered their talk back in a direction Jonah could more readily follow. The Brazilian cinema of the 60s and 70s, the brilliant madness of Glauber Rocha. The Americans listened intently, and Lázaro nimbly set about preparing more smoke. By the second round, the conversation had gotten predictably hazy and garbled. Teresa, Lázaro, and Bart were slipping more and more back into Portuguese. Octavio seemed annoyed at his inability to keep up. He started tugging at Bart's sleeve, and when she pushed him away, they got into a playfully sloppy tussle. Teresa started hooting and yelling at them to get a room already. Everyone was high. A long report of gunshots crackled through the house. There was a second of silence. Then more gunfire, louder, traveling in bursting echoes. Lázaro shoved the Americans to the ground. There were two loud bangs, then the sound of cries and the helter-skelter of human feet as a new hail of machine gun fire sweltered the air with deafening metallic impact. People were screaming. Single shots ricocheted, loud enough to come through distinctly above the fray. Jonah looked over at Octavio. He was holding Bart's against him, covering her head with his hands. He looked over at Lázaro, who said something, but the gunfire came again even louder and he couldn't make it out. There were more screams, some close and some distant, disconnected, lost to each other, coming from indeterminate corners of the night. Then it got quiet. Lázaro looked over. Catumbi, he said, without lifting his head.
Thank you. That's a fantastic passage, I think, to give a sense of how the novel interweaves these characters' connections with each other, the kinds of conversations they're having, but also this kind of omnipresence of violence that seems to haunt Jonah even as he explores his fugitive paths, his flights across the world. At the beginning of the novel, when he's teaching students in Red Hook, he talks about the tattoos that are inked on the forearms of his students, which are about their fellow students who'd been shot and killed in bursts of crossfire here in New York. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about the question of violence and also the question of how we should respond to or think about that. Jonah's despair about the world and about the violence that pervades the Black world in particular came up in your NPR interview with Scott Simon. But the review of your essays in the New York Times, however, pointed out that you have a refusal of despair in your critique of the world mood of Afro-pessimism. The reviewer, Gerald Walker, noted of the time of your writing from 2014 to 2020, he says, quote, "For African Americans in particular, these were years that yielded much about which to despair, and no doubt much despairing occurred and does still. The risk of succumbing to that despair is real, but doing so would be at odds with the Black tradition. The Black tradition McCarthy understands is resistance. So I have my own sense of how resistance appears in the Fugitivities, in the lines of flight implied by the title, but also the respite of what I can only call a kind of attenuated love, or chance love, love at a distance, which is conveyed really vividly, I think, in the letters and stories exchanged between characters like Jonah and Arna. Could you talk a little bit more about how you think the Black tradition, the Black literary tradition, offers resistance to despair?
Well, one of the things I would say is that I think part of what I'm seeking to evoke in the novel is both the ways in which Jonah as a character is extremely aware of a kind of omnipresent shadow or haunting of violence in the weave of Black life, but also fundamentally the ways in which exposure to that violence is deeply unequal. He himself, although there's a sense in which arguably there's a kind of brush with it in Rio, he himself is in a position that is deeply distant and in some ways very divided from that of his students, for example, you know, who all know someone who has lost someone to some extent, if they haven't lost someone themselves. And part of, for me, what the, you know, to me, it's also implied by the title itself. Part of the irony lies in the fact that Jonah, who has the means, in a sense, to sort of escape or avoid certain kinds of fate, feels all the more despairing about those conditions, all the more enmeshed and entrapped in them, even though it's not necessarily the case that he actually is in a kind of concrete material sense. And that's, I think, important because it's not really the case that, to my view, it's a matter of positing a kind of resistance to despair. It's rather a kind of qualitative and, I would say, affective relationship to a sense of a larger whole that one, whether one likes it or not, is tied to, even when one doesn't understand those ties or misunderstands those ties, and even when one misjudges those ties and those relations. And so I think for me, you know, there's not a kind of one-to-one sense of instrumentality or effectiveness that connects the artistic and expressive function to the political function of resistance. On the other hand, I think part of what forms a kind of line of continuity throughout the tradition is this engagement and awareness that there is a sense in which the problem of figuring out one's relationship to the world through race, in spite of race, because of race, whatever the case may be, shapes the kind of shapes both the attitude and the kinds of attention and the perspective that infuses the ethics, but also the aesthetics of the work itself. And so it's not really a matter, again, of kind of providing an antidote to despair.
Mhm.
It's not about arguing against the reasons for despair.
Mhm.
It's really more simply a kind of act of recognition that what's strange and wonderful and complicated in a million different ways are the kind is the enmeshing of both conditions that seem almost unimaginably sort of horrific and abject,
Mhm.
with things that are its opposite,
Mhm.
and things that are in many ways independent of that, and that these things coexist, but that the coexistence of these kind of almost antinomial forms of experience within one's subjectivity, that that gulf, that double consciousness, that sense of um, of a continuously complicating factor is, I think, one that there's a long history of Black artists, Black musicians, Black painters, Black writers trying to work out how to give expression to, and also how to kind of how to get certain forms of expression to accommodate, actually, and to change those forms, to bend them, to mess them up, to rearrange them, to press them, to I don't want to say to conform, but to appreciate and to include that kind of those sets of problems and those
Yeah.
kinds of experiences.
The questions that I'm going to turn to now from the audience are about some of these forms that you're talking about, and the kind of pressures placed on those forms, but also the pressure those forms place on Blackness. So I'm going to read from the Q&A now, and if there are any other questions, please feel free, audience members, to put them in the Q&A. To extend the conversation about genre between novel and essay, I'd love to hear Dr. McCarthy talk about poetry. His essay collection includes a stunning lecture, which introduces a global sense of Black poetics. Was this lecture actually delivered as such? How was it received? I've only read half the novel so far, but at one moment, Nathaniel's encounter with an anthology of poetry belonging to his mother seems to fuel his post-NBA desire to return to school. It's interesting to me that poetry is introduced in both books as an avenue towards pedagogy. But how else does this genre function for Dr. McCarthy?
Well, thank you for that question. The short answer is that I taught a course called Introduction to Black Poetry in 2019, and so that essay does come directly out of a real lecture, and the response of the students was magnificent. And
you want to just summarize it really quick for those who haven't read the essay?
Well, I think this is referring to the essay "To Make a Poet Black,"
Yeah.
Which is which explores frankly, complicated and bizarre ways in which poetry and race sort of have informed each other, and in particular, I draw out this sort of curious history of the ways in which the poet Sappho, who's often credited with being the kind of inventor and certainly the figure who most kind of introduces the lyric specifically, as opposed to the epic or some other form, into poetry, that there's a history of actually imagining her as Black. And to the extent that we understand her also to have that her sexuality is at a minimum complicated and arguably queer, that sort of makes her both as kind of a founding figure of poetry in the West, that it's interesting to think of that founding figure as being a Black queer woman.
And how did your students respond to that?
I think that there was there was a certain amount of I don't know, I would say maybe bafflement a little bit, because I think it's perhaps a kind of provocative argument. But I also think that there was a way in which it seemed to me that they saw it as making a good deal of sense, and certainly that it helped do something which the course as a whole was important for me to do, and to a certain extent, this is also true for the essay collection as a whole, which is to, I hope, give people a sense that there's actually a way of thinking about our history, both the parts that we know and the parts that we don't know, the parts that we quote unquote like and the parts that we quote unquote don't like, as being inextricably interrelated, and that when you actually unpack that and rebuild these things together and in conversation with each other, it means that, ideally, I would want, all students to show up in a classroom feeling like the material that we're engaging with, it's not just that it speaks to them, but that they have a relationship to it that they can see or imagine as a tangible one, and not just something sort of imposed from a sort of alien culture to them, or alien to their concerns or interests. So that, I think it went well. The point about poetry, though, is also an interesting one, because it's true that it comes up in many places in the novel, and I think that has everything to do with the fact that, for me, poetry was really sort of my first literary love, so to speak. And I would count myself among those writers who were sort of failed poets, who turned to the novel. And for example, I think an important figure for me, who had a kind of similar trajectory, is the Chilean writer Roberto Bollano, who began his I would say his literary career, peripatetic literary existence, as someone who self-conceived as a poet, but who eventually found his voice in the form of the novel. But I think that for me, I'm always trying to figure out how to get the novel to get closer, in some sense, to the lyric.
So this raises the question, I don't know who said this, but someone once said that literature or fiction, poetry should aspire to the condition of music. And one of the other questions, which brings up the topic that I wanted to cover, so I'm grateful for it. It says, Vincent Cunningham called you an artist of the year, an observation I totally got from reading your books. You are attentive to the music of experience, but also of language itself. When you write, do you put a lot of thought into language's musicality, and how important is it?
I'm almost tempted to say it's the only important thing, or the most important thing. You know, one of the things that I would say about this, though, is particularly within the context of the history of the Black literary tradition, there's always been this kind of fraught and complicated relationship to orality. So I think, for example, Gail Jones has this book, Liberating Voices, which makes this argument. It makes a lot of other really excellent points and arguments, but one of the major arguments of her book is that to a certain extent, the African-American literary tradition emerges out of writers trying to figure out how to solve this problem of transposing both a kind of inherited written literary heritage with an oral tradition, and how to get Black orality into and alongside and almost functioning as a kind of synthesis, perhaps at some points within the literary text. And to me, that's I've always felt that to be very true. And that sense then of rhythm and musicality and the question of the ear is both one that has a kind of, yeah, it does absolutely have a kind of relationship to music and to the lyric, which is of course etymologically connecting back to music as well, and to poetry, but also in a kind of more specific way to the musicality of vernacular speech, to the presence of orality and voice within the text. And you know, this is one of the reasons why, for example, I knew that I wanted to try and kind of make use to a certain extent of the epistolary.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, you know, letter writing in the novel, but part of the reason for that for me was precisely because it offered opportunities, among others. There's also sort of the jazz anecdote. There are various kinds of ways that I try and pull in and create occasions for that vernacular and that orality to come into the text and sort of live on the page alongside other kinds of discourse. And so to me the musicality is both about attention to sound, but it's also again, you know, I feel like I'm always drawing on Moten here, but it's also about getting the resonance of the social, of the sociality, the grain of the voice into the body of the text, and that I think is actually probably for me the most important aspect of musicality.
That's fantastic. One of our questioners, David Hobbs, very kindly reminded me that the quote about aspiring to the condition of music is Walter Pater. And he asked a very specific question, but it's on the topic of music. And I think it would be a great way for us to conclude our evening. He says, thinking about the essay about French rap and the moods that it refuses to engage, I wanted to ask what you make of the very recent rise of Mach Homie plus West Side Gun, of inclusion of Haitian Creole into what strikes me at least as a recognizably American beatscape, in a synthetic sense, like if RZA had grown up in Oakland. And why Pray for Paris and Pray for Haiti feel like they've landed so forcefully in this particular moment.
Well, to open it up a little bit to a more general and abstract concern, I would say that, in a number of the essays, I'm thinking, for example, of the last essay in the collection, Harlem is Everywhere, which is both in a kind of, it's a response to Ellison, to his famous essay Harlem is Nowhere, but it's also fundamentally about both the problem of gentrification, but also the kind of new forms of circulation that are happening in the contact in between Harlem as the, Mecca of the new Negro that Alain Locke, and the generation of the Harlem Renaissance as a kind of African-American project created in that space, but also the arrival, especially in the last few decades, of immigrants from Africa.
Like me. Here in Harlem.
It's true. But and also, right, the ways in which the kind of this latest sort of generation of African artists like WizKid and others who are sort of putting out the latest iteration of sort of what they call Afrobeat, right, are responding to, as Robin D.G. Kelly has called it, this constant back and forth, this constant call and response, where the musics of especially West Africa and African America have been co-constructing each other.
And the Caribbean.
And the Caribbean, and now also Europe, right? And so in general and beyond, right? And so in general, I do think that this to me speaks a little bit to the point about the ways in which, when I quote, Fela Kuti, who says that, music is the weapon of the future. I wish I take it to mean that, it's not that these kinds of new emergent cultural syntheses solve our political dilemmas. I would never make that claim, and it would be, I think it would be somewhat foolish and perilous to do so. But it's also true that, as human beings, we live in language, we live in culture, we live in these, we live in, the worlds that are shaped, yes, by the hard, concrete, material determinants, but also in the kind of symbolic landscape that we generate for ourselves. And I think that the fact that you have this kind of really increasingly almost synergetic proliferation, where these cultural forms are kind of linking up and connecting and generating new forms, but also forms that are, linking things that make, it's true, I mean, they both don't make sense and make sense at the same time. And again, it's sort of this thing where it's not necessarily that it's about, for instance, the political effectiveness of any particular movement, but on the other hand, even the way in which, as we saw, sort of the George Floyd protests took on this immediately global sense of resonance and are kind of become this sort of globally shared event and filter into the consciousness. And yes, the social movements in various distinct places, it could be in Nigeria, it could be in Haiti, where certain demands, and then also the artists in those spaces picking up on certain themes, but also finding, right, like vehicles for expression that are being borrowed, that are being remixed, that are being reassembled. All of that to me is a sign that, in a sense, as I often like to say, you know, um, Black culture continues to function as the pharmacon. That is, as both the thing that is the problem and simultaneously the solution. The thing that the powers that be really want to kind of fix and constrain and discipline and correct and absorb and various kinds of things. And to a certain extent, Black culture can serve those ends quite well. And sometimes it can be the best glue for those things. And yet simultaneously at the same moment, it also seems to be the most powerfully sort of disruptive force, an explosive force, and constantly forcing people who wished that certain questions had been settled or taken off the table to come back and say, oh no, actually it turns out I still have to think about this. I still have to work through this. We still have to address, this thing that I thought I had made a kind of settled thing in the past. And so I do think that, without getting into the specific examples that he evoked, though they're very fascinating and rapidly evolving, I think they speak to the larger point that certainly I do think the essays are interested in, which is the ways in which we're living through a moment of extraordinary sort of fermentation, and we don't know what the outcome of that is going to be. But I think that we all almost sort of intuitively understand that both the stakes of it and the impacts of it are going to be enormous. It's not trivial. And to that extent, it deserves serious thought, serious criticism, and serious engagement at every level.
Your work captures the sense of diaspora, the sense of circulation, the sense of cross-pollination, and in some ways is lending the sense of fugitivity, of constant movement, constant flight that belongs at the heart of what we call movement when we talk about social movements. So I want to express my deepest thanks for you to creating these works, which I hope that our audience members will pick up if they don't already have copies of, because I do think this is a necessary intervention in some sense, an unsettling of the things we thought we had settled, as you said, and a reinfusion of movement and energy into the fugitivity of Black life. Thank you so much, Professor McCarthy. And thank you so much to everyone for coming.
Well, thank you. Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you both. Thanks to Jesse and Namwali. Thanks to all of you out there for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about these books and purchase them on harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a great night. Keep reading, and everybody, please be well. Thank you.